everyone. Welcome back to the 27th Annual National Security Conference here at Duke Law School. And we're having our ultimate speaker here to close out the conference. And I can't begin to tell you how excited and privileged I am to be able to introduce to you General Phil Breedlove. His bio is on the agenda. Please click on it. But I think there's many highlights in his career, but his former leadership of NATO probably is at the top of the list of what might interest you on that fascinating bio. F-16 pilot, multiple command tours, and I can tell you this about General Breedlove is that he had a great reputation of being what we JAGs called very JAG friendly, very lawyer friendly, and very law conscious. This wasn't an instance as exists from time to time in the military, particularly of having to convince an operator, especially in the Air Force, the aviation, the single seat aviation community, about the importance of the law. I'm not going to take up any more of the time. I'm going to jump right into it. And General Breedlove, thank you again for being with us. And it's on the top of everybody's mind, the crisis in the Ukraine. What's your take?
Well, first of all, Charlie, thanks for having me. And I hope at the end or somewhere we can talk just a little bit about my journey with JAGs and lawyers, because I think there's a few things to learn there.
I think so, yes.
So, as you mentioned, I was the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, from 13 to 16, May of 13 to May of 16. And so the 2.5 years of my time was dominated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the first two, when they went into the Crimea and to the Donbass in southeast Ukraine. And how then we changed NATO and started a series of actions that now have resulted in not a perfect, but a much more ready NATO. And so my whole command was truly wrapped around how we addressed Russia then. And so now we see much of the same playing out. And I'd just like to lay a couple of foundational thoughts on this, because I believe we'll all agree, but maybe we won't. First of all, this is a completely contrived, completely manufactured crisis by Mr. Putin. The whole premise of why he's there, etc., is preposterous, ludicrous, really. I mean, as you've heard him in the last day and a half talking about, we have to go into Kyiv to save it from the neo-Nazis and the drug dealers that are running the country. I mean, the Russian information campaign has kind of taken a step backward now into the preposterous. But the fact of the matter is Mr. Putin has contrived this. Second thing relates to the first, and that is we are completely concerned and trying to think through how to help Ukraine because they're under attack. And Ukrainian sons and daughters, mothers and fathers and children are dying right now because of Russia's attack. But we also have to remember that this is bigger than Ukraine. I'm hoping that those in your school have had a look at those two documents that Mr. Putin sent us some months ago or some weeks ago and said, okay, these are my demands, sign them or we will use other measures. Well, we now understand what those other measures are. It's an invasion. If you look at those two documents, it's about restructuring the security architecture and infrastructure of Europe. It's about rebuilding the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. It's about reestablishing dominance of those nations along the periphery of Russia. It's about rolling history back to pre-1997, at least in the documents, but truly to the Soviet Union days. And if we have the framework that he demands Ukraine be in his orbit, he says it's Russia and they're all Russians, and we put that up against the fact that he wants to rebuild this infrastructure, we see that his desires are much bigger. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where one of the world's most powerful military nations is using its land force to cross internationally recognized borders and taking over another free and independent nation by military force. And what we see sadly is Ukraine very much standing alone, fighting for freedom, fighting for self-determination, fighting for their sovereign right to choose, and Russia trying to impose their will over it. So I think I'll just throw that out. If you want to go further into sort of the tactical and operational details, we can do that too.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing from a legal perspective, and we just had a previous speaker talk about this, some things we haven't seen really for decades, and something we call levy en masse, where the population is rising up and they get the status of combatants. That said, I think it's wonderful to see that. From a military perspective, is that going to be successful? Can they really stop the Russians?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of gradations of this. If you saw in the last 2 weeks running up to the actual beginning of the invasion, Ukraine was concentrating very much on creating these territorial defense forces. And these forces are more like aren't regular army forces. They're just not as well trained, and they're not assembled to fight in disparate areas. They're assembled to defend their local area, and that's one group of this that you're talking about. The second group is what has happened in just the last couple of days, where the government is handing out weapons to everyone, and now just your common father, brother, in some cases, mother and grandmothers, if you saw the pictures this morning, are holding a Kalashnikov rifle in their hands. And that's a very different force. This is undisciplined. I'm not saying that it's bad, but you're not going to expect a huge sort of military impact. But what it does do is cause problems for an invading force that seeks to subjugate the nation and its citizens. Here, Charlie, is where the first force, that territorial force, really comes into play. I think we need to be very careful that we don't overassume what we're seeing. Some observe, and I believe there's some truth to it, that the attack has slowed a bit, and it is being less successful than was anticipated by Russia. In fact, there's some indication this morning that Mr. Putin is livid and may have canned or sacked some of his leadership because things are not moving as fast as possible. But when you plan for something to be quick and dramatic, and then it takes longer than expected, what the first effect is that your logistics trains and your supply lines are not matched to the task at hand. If you're planning for 5 days of intense fighting, and we're not there yet, but I'm just making an example. If you're planning for 5 days of intense fighting and now you're 15 days into it, you didn't plan appropriately for your logistics, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we believe is already happening is Mr. Putin is at it a little longer, especially around Kyiv, than he expected to be. And we are seeing possibly some strains already on the logistics lines, pictures of non-damaged tanks parked by the road, ostensibly because there's no gas. Excuse me.
Yeah, that does bring up the what sometimes those who don't have military experience don't, the old adage that, amateurs, talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
Exactly. I've used those lines twice this morning already. This is important. And frankly, I think this may be manifesting itself a little bit in what's happening. But again, this fog and friction, the first news is never the right news, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that we yet have to learn.
Since we're talking about the news, let's talk a little bit about the information war, or what wrote a post on this called "The War. Are we ready for the war in the infosphere?" Russians, historically, that's been a big part of their stratagems. So what are your views, and how successful do you think that they are? And are there ways that NATO and the US and the world really can counter?
This is a huge question, and you need to keep me in line because I could talk for hours on this. I'm writing we won't call it a book, but I'm writing something now called The Speed and Power of a Lie. And it's all about how primarily Russia, but nations and entities like Russia use that lie through all manner of things, social media, et cetera, to forge this information war. So where to start? The first thing is that I would like to make, because I think it's something for your folks to talk about in the future, is that the West, and especially the United States, has truly never entered the information war at the strategic or operational level. We've had some times in our past, back in a lot of the things we did in Central America, et cetera, we had some informational wars that were happening at a very lower level. But at the level that Russia, China, Daesh, or ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, some of these folks have waged wars against us or with us. We have never really entered that sphere. You may remember from your uniform days, I think it was in 2003 or 4, OSD tried to create the Office of Strategic Information. And frankly, the Congress got a hold of it and said, you're going to lie to us and you're going to lie to the American people while you lie to the rest of the world. We're not having it. And they pulled the funding, if you remember how that all played out. And so when we actually have tried in the past to fight in this space, we've been thwarted, rightfully or wrongfully, I don't judge, but we were thwarted. And so we have been on the receiving end of information war now for nearly 2 decades. And I often say it's sort of like taking the world #1 tennis player and sending him to the French Open and saying, you have to receive serve all match long, because that's what we're doing. Literally, the West and the United States is we are receiving serve and we're not serving back in these spaces. We tried a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago now, to build what is known as the GEC. I would ask your folks to look into the GEC, the Global Engagement Center in DOS, the Department of State. And it was built to organize our government to be able to fight an information fight. It died in internal cancer. It's still alive, but it is now doing something very different than what it was built to do. And that's because entities in our own government said, oh, wait a minute. They can speak for everybody else in the government, but they don't speak for me in my part of the world. And that gathered steam, and the GEC has largely been neutered in this way. And so we have not taken the field in information war. And that's something that has to be reckoned with at a policy and legal level first.
I often think that maybe, we have rules of engagement for the use of deadly force. And sometimes it's easier for a commander to use deadly force than it is to try to do a nonviolent information counterstrike. And maybe we need something like information rules of engagement.
Well, you're exactly right. And it's bigger than just information. Think space, think cyber, think almost all the new areas we're uncomfortable with how we fight and what constitutes fighting, et cetera, et cetera. So you're exactly right.
You know, one of the things that we talk about, and I know that NATO actually has established in their legal office, has tried to develop this idea of how the Russians in particular tend to use law to weaponize law. And I think this started during your tenure, and in a lot of ways, the NATO is ahead. They're not where they perhaps should be or need to be, but they're ahead of the U.S. in terms of treating law as a weapon and trying to anticipate how the adversary is going to manipulate it. Is this something you think the U.S. military ought to think about? We don't have, the Chinese have doctrine, the Russians have doctrine. We don't have that kind of doctrine.
Well, we're just one element of national power. I believe our whole nation needs to think about it, but certainly we do. Wes Clark actually tells a story that I think is compelling, and he's trying to pitch that same approach right now, and I think it's worth looking at. The war, when we were having the fight in the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, et cetera, and the atrocities that were happening there, people were falling out on the normal sides that they fall out on. Some were aligned with Russia and Serbia and all these things, and others were aligned with the West, and their vision of what was happening was completely dominated by sort of their political geostrategic alignment. But things changed when the leadership of the aggressors were deemed by the international court as criminals. Now it becomes much harder for nations who were formerly aligned with those nations to stand up and say, oh, we understand he's an international criminal by the international court, but we still align with him. Do you get my point?
Correct. Yeah.
So the tide of opinion and support began to change once the actions of Milosevic and others were labeled criminal, etc. And Wes Clark, I think, makes a great argument now, and I joined him in that argument, that what you see going on in Ukraine is tantamount to criminal activity. I mean, I said it the first. This is a completely contrived crisis. There is no good explanation for what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine, and he's saying on the TV, "We're not killing civilians." He's killing civilians. It's happening, and so this is a mess. And that may be an example of what you're asking, and that is that we need to understand it. And then I would let me just one more quick point. I think that the Russians, and there are other countries, let's don't drag them in because that would just open a wider argument. But there are countries that remember the portions of history that support their narrative, and they are fiercely good. Some of them, I mean, I respect the way that they will go into that history and pull out the legal ramifications of things that countries have done to make their argument. And frankly, sometimes we in America are challenged by things we've done in our past. And so this warfare, or lawfare, as some people call it, it's a tool that we have to not only understand and begin and be able to defend against, but I believe there is places where we need to be able to use it as well.
You know, that's in lawfare, of course, is very close to my heart. You know, but I think that, and I think that is a good identification of something we need to work on in this country, especially because, you know, we're kind of an ahistorical society that we don't really study or have a public consciousness of history. Whereas and tell me if I have this wrong, I think in Europe and in Russia and in China and other places, they have a very keen understanding or appreciation for history, even if their view of it is deeply flawed. And I think, you know, it's sometimes hard for us to counter it because we don't have a good enough grip on the history ourselves.
So we are not only legal, as you said, or excuse me,
Ahistorical, yeah.
Yeah, ahistorical. We are also ageographical. So I was teaching at Georgia Tech not long ago, and I asked someone I said, anybody in the class go put their finger on Nagorno-Karabakh? There was one individual, and he was a military student that was there getting a master's degree. I said, okay, anybody except for the Army guy, can you go find Nagorno-Karabakh on the map? And it was not well answered. And I wasn't being a jerk. It's just that we don't have the vision that others in this world do, that there's a broad world outside of our borders sometimes.
Yeah, I wonder, and I'm not really saying this facetiously, I wonder how many Americans even today could find Ukraine on a map readily.
Yeah, exactly.
So how much of a wake-up call do you think this is for NATO, or was it, do you think that you might have seen in the news, I think the German general put out a pretty stark email about, Germany really isn't prepared, the military is hollow and so forth. And here it's one of the major economies of the world, and now we're in a crisis. What do you think about that? And let's look ahead a little bit. What do you think is going to happen to NATO moving ahead?
So let me answer the latter one first, and then we'll go back to the other about, is it a wake-up call? I'm just going to tell you straight up. You have, where you sit is sometimes where you stand. So everybody in the audience needs to understand I was the former commander of NATO. But beyond that, while I served 3 times in Asia in my life, I've served 8 times in Europe. I have 2 daughters born there, and all 3 of my children grew up there. So I am a bit of a Europe file. So take everything I say from here on out with that small grain of salt. We need to be intellectually honest. But the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, and opinion of a lot of people who are looking at especially what's happening in Europe now, and when I say now, I really am talking about from 2008 forward. I think NATO is going to be more important in the next 70 years than it was in the last 75. There was the joke that NATO is all about keeping US in, Germany down, and Russia out. Well, sadly, there was some truth to all of that, but we grew out of that, and Germany became one of the most amazing forces in NATO, in forces for good in NATO during the Cold War days, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, we are now going to be in a state of what I call constant war. I mean, the below the line war that some people call hybrid or gray zone, it's going on in every capital right now. It's going on in the United States Capitol. I mean, look at what happened in our last elections. Look at what are going to happen in our next elections, et cetera, et cetera. There is warfare happening at this below the line of kinetic activity in every capital, and it's different from nation to nation depending on what Russia can get away with. Whether you like the term or not, some people don't believe it exists, but Google Gerasimov doctrine and look at some of the PowerPoint that they put out there and explain the way they attack a nation. That's going on in every capital around them right now. So the way that we come together to fight this, the cyber attacks, the information wars, et cetera, it's going to make the alliance more important than it's ever been, in my opinion. And all you have to do is listen to Mr. Putin in the last 3 or 4 days. He threatens nukes all the time. We need an alliance that is willing to face and be able to address his nuclear ambitions. So I do believe it's more important. As far as a wake-up call, I think it's happening. First of all, you are seeing now nations that have set the fence on many issues when it comes to Russia, beginning to speak up in ways that they've never spoke up. And that includes even Germany and France. And what we also see is that NATO has come to the realization that Russia is willing to use its military to go across internationally recognized borders in Europe. And so for the first time in the history of NATO, in the last 36 hours, NATO has stood up a part of the NRF. They have activated the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. First time in the history of the NATO response force that any part of it has been activated like that. And they have voted additional authorities to the SACEUR for the alerting and arranging of military forces. So they've taken unprecedented steps to say, yep, this is different. This man is off the reservation, and we need to figure out how we can keep him on the reservation.
One of the students have had a question, Jeannie Bianchi, my wonderful research assistant, and she asked, what potential problems do you see with the Lindley French analysis that calls for European countries to prioritize military cooperation through themselves as opposed to NATO and individual forces? Yeah, I think Mr. Macron has.
Yeah, Mr. Macron has talked about this all the time. My answer surprises a lot of people because the first thing I say is I don't worry about this. Almost all of the EU nations, 24 or 26 now, I've lost the count, are also NATO nations. So any improvements that they make to their military also improves NATO. We're so intertwined there that it's hard to sort us out in some cases. There is an important caveat. What we don't need in a European army or a better EU force is redundant activities to what NATO already does good. Listen, I'm a 4-star general, so I could say this. We don't need more fat cat 4-star general headquarters and flags and buildings and fancy dinners and all that stuff. What we need to do is improve our forces. 2 great examples, and I don't want to waste a lot of time. The 2 entities have very different capabilities. The NATO force has a very defensive posture, and the EU force has tools that the NATO force doesn't have. Here's an example. So when we had the pirates off of Somalia, we sent a NATO military force with NATO command and control there, and we really changed what they were doing on the sea. But all they did was go ashore and say, we'll wait NATO out. They're not going to spend the money to stay here for the next 40 years. And that was a good assumption because that's exactly what would have happened. So when we saw them go ashore and begin to wait us out, and now we're out there steaming and already navies are saying, I've got better things to do with my ships than this. We finally married with the EU, who has the ability, because they have all of that connections to the law, connections to the policing, connections to the government. And the EU came in, and we married up our operations such that the EU began to not work with the countries to deny them sanctuary on the shore, and we denied them operations at sea. And that, coupled with, we got to give credit to the shipping lines, they made a few changes. We essentially eliminated that. So the strength of NATO, command and control and force, married to the strength of the EU's to be able to reach into all of those other institutions of governmental power and connect to them, we put together a force. Now here's a test that everybody always fails. So the military force that's in Bosnia-Herzegovina right now, whose force is that? Well, if you Google it, you'll find out it's an EU force. Mm-hmm. And it is an EU force commanded by a NATO general, because NATO brings all the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control, and all the things that it does well. So once again, we take EU forces, marry it with what NATO does so good, and we've got a force that works extremely well in Bosnia-Herzegovina right now. And this is the model that works. Rather than trying to create friction and talk about arguing, let's just accept that if EU gets better and doesn't waste money creating capability that NATO already has, and the 2 of them work together, then the future for all of our military forces, I think, is bright. So I just don't get wrapped around. People are trying to make a fight out of this and pick at it. And I just don't buy that fight.
We have, before we leave NATO, and probably want to get back to NATO and Ukraine before we close, but I do want to talk about your experiences with lawyers and so forth. But before we leave that, we're seeing an unusual amount of cooperation between Russia and China. How does that impact NATO's calculation, especially looking forward? Because NATO, really historically has been focused on the Russian threat.
Yeah, now this is, I'm going to speak out both sides of my mouth here. If China and Russia truly begin to collaborate deeply at an operational and strategic level, this is bad. This is really bad. The things that they're doing together now are terribly superficial. They'll call an exercise together and they may steam within 200 miles of each other, but it's not like NATO nations sailing in the same formation, flying in the same formation, fighting together on the battlefield. They're just not at that point yet. It's more now, I think, for geopolitical impact in the information spaces that we see them cooperating. And a few things stick out to me. If you remember in 2014, Russia encountered a lot more international pressure than they thought when they invaded the Crimea and when they invaded the Donbass in the southeast part of Ukraine. So what did they do? They went out to try to form this relationship with China to say, better get yourselves aligned or we in China are going to form a bloc. And what happened? They cut this big chemical deal where China is buying Russian gas. And if you read what China has written about it privately since that time, and not some of it not so private, they completely bent Russia over the barrel. Russia is still losing money on every barrel of that deal they sell to China. China so abused them in that deal that it's almost a laughing matter. And during that time, China said, well, they're a good little brother. Do you get the connotation? And so then not too long ago, there was a Chinese officer who supposedly didn't know his words were going to get out there, whether that's true or not. But he made a statement like, hey, I can march in Russia for months and never see a Russian force. That's even worse now because Russia's moved so much of its east of the Ural forces towards Ukraine that it would be even worse. So I see issues in the fabric of that tell me that this is not what it's trying to be pitched in the public. But make no mistake, if they begin to seriously collaborate at the operational and strategic level, that will be a problem for us.
I agree. In fact, I thought that there wouldn't be a major war because Russia did bring its Far Eastern armies, and I assumed that they would not want them damaged and degraded, because obviously, no matter, even if the war stopped right now, they'd have to refit and before they'd be ready to fight out there. I do want to get back to NATO and the Ukraine, but let me ask you this. As I mentioned earlier, you had, before it was kind of fashionable, shall we say, you had a great relationship with your lawyers and especially your military lawyers. Why is that? And let me go a step further. What did you like and what did you not like? And looking ahead, what are your views?
So there's so much to talk about here. So I want to talk to you about just sort of the Commander JAG thing. But if I forget to do that, forget at that point, also, I want to talk about sort of how the JAG is your partner in a war. Okay. So if I forget, remind me on that.
Will do.
The third thing I want to tell you about is that from the School of Hard Knocks, the JAG has still got to be your friend after you retire, especially if you retire as a senior officer. Mm-hmm. Okay, so help me. I'm getting old and sometimes I forget, but help me to get to all three of those. So the first one, and this is a bit funny, but it's not funny. As a young officer, as when you're just a simple tool like a fighter pilot is at the beginning of his life, you see the JAG as nothing but a threat. This is a person who's going to get me in trouble. This is a person who's going to keep me from flying. This is a person that's going to keep me from getting promoted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the JAG is truly enemy of the state as a young person. And I think to some degree, there may be young enlisted people that feel the same way. But life fundamentally changes when you become responsible for mission. When now you're not just the simple tool, but you're responsible for assembling, training, equipping, and employing all those simple tools and to accomplish a mission. It doesn't take you very long to understand that the JAG is an incredible part of your team. The JAG is an enabler in so many ways. And the ability for you to keep good order and discipline inside of your ranks, which are important for accomplishing the mission, quickly turns your opinion of who the JAGs are. I remember, I'm going to tell a 1-minute story. I remember a particular time in my first squadron command where I had the world's best, we call them phase maintenance team, very deep maintenance, 4 or 5 people that work together all the time. And I had the best one on the base, probably among the top 4 or 5 in the nation. And all of a sudden that entity began to work horribly. Things were not going well, and quality escapes and problems with the airplanes. Come to find out that I had an incredibly disruptive person on the team who held some beliefs that were tearing the team apart, and he was openly practicing those very interesting beliefs. And so in trying to figure out how to handle that, the normal fighter pilot way of doing that would be to go in and fire about 4 missiles and be done with it. But of course, you understand that's not the way this has to happen. And so literally, that was the first time in my life I formed a team with the JAG and said, okay, we have to respect everyone and everyone's beliefs, but we don't have to tolerate behavior inside of a workplace that totally destroys the productivity of a formerly highest functioning team. And so the JAG worked me through how to fix that without trampling personal rights and beliefs, but by thereby fixing the problem and helping me get my high performing team back on track. After that, literally, and that was as a lieutenant colonel, from there on, it was clear to me that anytime I started a new command or even a supervisory position that was not a command like the vice chief of the Air Force, that one of the first things I needed to do was have a relationship with a JAG that first started with complete trust and confidence, so that I could take things to that person and know that they weren't going to blow up in my face for nefarious reasons. Knowing that I had a teammate that had the same vision of what we needed from the organization and would help me work towards that vision. And I don't know if you know, Charlie, but I had 8 major commands in my life. And so 8 times as a commander with the authorities that commanders have, I can't even imagine getting through that whole gamut successfully with a JAG that I didn't trust or didn't sort of Vulcan mind meld with on how we were going to work forward. And so I now mentor the Capstone Joint 1 stars. I mentor the Pinnacle, the Joint 3 stars, and I also mentor our Air Force 2-star course. And this conversation is one of the most important I have with them in the mentoring, which is, I don't know what your relationship is. You probably wouldn't be here if you didn't have a good one, but let me tell you, you will not survive your GO commands and your GO years if you don't have a teammate that is your accountability partner and listens and is on your team for the vision of where you're going. And when you have that in a JAG, life is a whole lot simpler. I think that closes out item 1. And you want me to go on?
Yes, sir.
So secondarily, you know that several of my commands, including 2 of my joint commands, our nation was fighting, and I was in charge of fighting forces. And if you've ever watched how a JFAC runs a battle, the JAG is literally on his hip the whole time, because every time you are talking a sensitive target, we're going to be making decisions about the suitability of our attack and the acceptability of our methods. And whether if we accomplish what we accomplish, it's legal in the end game. And so I can absolutely tell you how to blow a building up and do it extremely well. But when we look at what could be the possible collateral damage, does that fit within the limits and that which is set by the president sometimes on down in some cases? These items are very much a place where the commander is going to do this. He's going to turn and look at his JAG, and he or she will render an opinion that then either enables the commander or suggests caution. The JAG doesn't make the decision, but the commander makes a decision based on what the JAG tells them, and all of these things come into play. And here's the other thing. When you are on the heat of the floor near the execution cell during something like a Osama bin Laden raid or whatever, well, you saw the team that was overseeing that. But if you're doing a big fight, you can't have a JAG that says, well, wait a minute, let me go think about that. Or wait a minute, I need to call my boss. Or wait a minute, because we don't get to wait 20 seconds in some of these decisions. So you have to have a JAG that has a certain amount of chutzpah and is confident in him or herself to be able to advise you at threat speed. And these are not easy things to do. And it takes a certain type. And so that's the fighting. Now I'm going to share something incredibly personal, but I do this with every general officer I mentor. And that is, in your retired life, the JAGs almost become more important than they were before. And in 10 seconds or less, I was asked to do something when I retired that the previous 4 SACEURs had done. Write this thing with this particular group, et cetera, et cetera. And so since the previous 4 SACEURs had done it and nobody had ever had any issues with it, I agreed to do it, and I didn't consult my JAG. And at some point, someone determined that action was too close to working directly for a foreign government, which you cannot do in your retirement. And so I was a rather large sum of my own money, 2-digit thousands worth of my own money, into a project that I had to quit because a opinion was rendered that it was inappropriate, even though the previous 4 had done. Now, I'm not blaming that on the JAG. I'm blaming it on me. And I tell all the general officers now, in your retirement, you still need to be talking to them, and they have a duty to serve you on these matters to keep you out of trouble. And it cost me double the amount of money I made in my first year as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force because I didn't consult my JAG. And so even into retirement, this relationship with people who will give you advice is still important. So I went quickly, but I think there's sort of 3 different views of this relationship.
That's tremendous. We are unfortunately spooling down here, but do you have some leadership lessons or even life lessons that you could share? We have a lot of young military officers online and law students and so forth. You've been very successful. It's always great to hear, people ask you what secrets of success and leadership lessons and so forth. Can you share a few with us?
Well, let me do that and also mention something you and I talked about a little bit, and that is a couple of my mentors. And I'll put some leadership lessons in there. The first leadership lesson is that, when you are in that very first assignment, and I jokingly say this, please don't allow this to color any thoughts. You're sort of the simple tool. You're the fighter pilot dummy. Go destroy the place I tell you to go destroy. That kind of thing. But when you get past that first level and you start dealing with other people who are accomplishing the mission, I think one of my most important life lessons was learned from Lieutenant Colonel James Haggerty. So a very young officer in the grand scheme of things, who really focused me on what it means to take care of your troops and enable your troops to do the mission. Because the more senior you become, it's less and less about you doing the mission. It's about you training, equipping, and enabling those who do the mission. And Jim Haggerty, he's passed now. I would never call him Jim to his face. Even when I was a 4-star, I called him sir, because he taught me about taking care of the troops, about investing your time in your troops, and they then will take care of the mission and take care of you. And that's probably the most important lesson I ever learned. The second, let me go to the far other end of the extreme and also mention a man who's passed, and that is Colin Powell, was a late in life mentor of mine. When I became the SACUR, I needed to be able to talk to people who had had all the jobs that Colin Powell had, from national security advisor to his military jobs as a COCOM and others. And he was so generous with me, even to the point of having me out to his house for breakfast so that we could have a long conversation apart from people who would bother him or I in our normal days. And a couple of things that he taught me were what they're hard to understand. And I get a little goofy sometimes when I talk about it, especially now that he's passed. But the first thing I would tell you is that whether you agree with him in life and some of the things that he decided in life or not, he had the courage of his convictions. And what he told me more than once was, Phil, you are where you are because people know you can do the job and they respect your experience. So don't be a yes man. Don't go with the crowd when it's easy. Be yourself. Have the courage of your convictions to stand up for what you believe, because that's why they put you where you are. And he also sort of tweaked me a little bit on message, because one time I said, I've got to go back to the NAC and talk to them about what I'm recommending for Russia, as they have just previously invaded Ukraine. And then I said, next week I got to go testify in the SASC. And I'm just worried about how I'm going to recraft this message. And he looked me right in the eye. He said, don't. He says, I've listened to you. You say the right things. Don't change them. Say them a lot. Repetition and simplicity is important. And, I know this sounds like a trivial thing that I'm bringing up, but it's really important for us to understand that you're put in positions because people believe you're not only qualified, but that you're more capable and you will grow. And so don't go someplace and think I have to change myself now because I'm the SACUR of NATO. No, you have the courage of your convictions that got you to where you are. Be yourself, get on message, stay on message, and don't let outside people don't let them affect you know, who you are and what you're there to do. You do the job that you were hired to do and you were prepared for, and move out and I can't say the words I was going to say, but let those other people take care of themselves.
Sir, thank you so much. You've been unbelievably generous with your time. I think we were talking before that you have some more I won't say taskings, but sort of taskings for the rest of the day. What you've shared with us is just absolutely fabulous, your insights. And I want you to know you have a standing invitation to come to Duke Law School and on our dime, by the way, and share with us more of your wisdom. And it's great to see you. And again, thank you so much. We could not have closed out our conference with a better speaker. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, sir. Hope to see you.
You know, if I come up to Duke, I'll have to wear this pin when I come.
That could be an issue. That, you know, we'll have to get out our drones here, but take it easy, sir.
That's
Thanks
a lot.
again. Bye now.